So collecting some armies of Warhammer 40k will definitely set you back a lot more than others. Let's talk about the ones that are seen as most and least pricey, and the factors that make them so. Jumping straight in with the cheaper end of the spectrum, we've got the Adeptus Custodes, perhaps most commonly considered to be the cheapest army to be collecting in Warhammer 40k, at least if you're collecting Games Workshop's plastic kits rather than going for their Forge World range. Typically in Warhammer 40k, the armies that are very elite tend to be some of the cheapest to collect in game, and Custodes take that to the absolute epitome, with even their standard foot troops being 45 point per model Custodian Guard, so it means that you don't really need all that many of them to make a rather indomitable golden battle line. Their individual units are really quite inexpensive in themselves, but they are further helped by a rather good discount kit. This one gets you a box of Custodian Guard, some Virtus Praetor jet bikes, and 2 of the boxes of Sisters of Silence, perhaps one of the most expensive elements of the army if you're collecting through Games Workshop's minis. Depending on how aggressively you build the characters, you could have anywhere up to 800 points worth of models in one box here, though even if you build all of them as generic rank and file, you're still getting well in excess of 500 points. For other advantages for the faction, the Custodians have also got a few other fairly recent big discount boxes as well. Their Christmas Battle Force got you the vast majority of a 2000 point army in just one discount box, and the Boarding Patrol was kind of nice as well. And I feel that armies in 40k are generally helped out by having a fairly small and compact range. It means that if you don't have all that many units in an army to collect, the end point of a fairly maximally complete collection will be a fair bit closer. Compared with, say, if you were collecting something at the other end of the spectrum, something like Space Marines, where they've got so many units that you could just basically keep on collecting for a ridiculously long time and still not have a copy of every single unit in their roster. Finally, I feel like one element that maybe isn't talked about so much is that Custodian units have their characters basically included in the squads, so if you get some Alaris Terminators, you could build one as a Terminator Shield Captain, and the same goes for the Captain on Foot, the Jet Bikes, and the Sisters of Silence. That's really quite a nice advantage, as Games Workshop tends to charge a fair bit more for characters if they're sold separately, whereas for these they're included in at least a reasonably priced box by Games Workshop standards. For downsides and more expensive elements of the army, the Sisters of Silence tend to be far pricier per point, and of course if you go delving into the realms of Forge World, things are going to get very expensive very quickly, so if you want Caladius Grav tanks and fancy dreadnoughts and things, then you might be paying a lot more. I guess for those, at least there's some option to find some 3D printed proxy models. A fair few people do seem to make some. Throughout this video, I thought I'd talk a bit about points per dollar in Warhammer 40k, as I think it's perhaps one of the most helpful metrics in determining how expensive an army is to collect. Obviously there's other things that determine value, say how much plastic you get for your money, or how nice the miniature sculpts are, but practically for putting an army of say 2000 points on the tabletop, if that was your eventual aim, the more points that you get for the money spent, the closer you're going to get to that goal, and in general the better value the army is going to be. I'm going to work in points per dollar just for consistency, though of course you can roughly translate this into your own currencies. My rough rule of thumb though is that generally things that are around about 1 or 2 points per dollar are fairly bad value as Warhammer goes. It means that say if you had 2000 points worth of those units, you'd be spending somewhere around $1,000 to $2,000 to make that happen, really quite a lot for one army. Some of the worst examples from Games Workshop absolutely do break the 1 point per dollar, but we'll get to those later. Otherwise, for things with slightly better ratios, I'd say 2 to 3 points per dollar is fairly standard for Warhammer 40k. Anything 3 to 4 I'd rate as fairly good. The majority of the combat patrol boxes tend to be in this kind of region, and then anything where you're getting more than 4 points per dollar is generally pretty good by Games Workshop standards towards getting an army together. Some of the 40k starter sets get into this range, the Leviathan box was, and some of the better combat patrols like the Custodes one. Moving on though, and perhaps seen as one of the other cheapest armies in the game right now, though perhaps not quite on the level of the Custodes, are the Grey Knights, another very old hyper-elite army with some older plastic kits that generally don't seem to charge too much for themselves for their privilege, and again get you really quite a lot of points on the table for the money that you spend. Their combat patrol is a kind of interesting one. Compared with other combat patrols, the on-paper discount that it gets you is a bit less than most of them, but on the other hand most people do see it as a pretty reasonable box set, as basically Grey Knights don't really have all that many plastic kits in the first place. Getting a Dread Knight, some Strike Marines and some Terminators pretty much covers the entire faction, so even a small discount on that is pretty handy. The Terminator Librarian's by no means a bad HQ choice as well, and he could conceivably run multiples. Otherwise, again, they're a very elite army, so fewer models are generally needed, and particularly in 10th edition, they've been paying a big premium for their teleport type rules, which means that their units cost a lot of points in game. It means that the Strike Squad box, where you typically get 10 models in it, is particularly good value in terms of getting points on the board. Again, for most of the variants, that one cracks 4 points per dollar, which is kind of nice. The flexibility is quite good as well. Terminators and Strike Marines can be used to represent different things. You could use the same Grey Knight Strike Marine to represent things like a filler in a Purgation squad or a Purifier squad potentially, or you could use a Terminator to represent a Paladin if desired. Again, the range is very small like the Custodes, just revolving around mainly those 3 plastic kits, so less things are needed to have a fairly complete army and knowing that you'll have all the strong options. I'd say perhaps one of the biggest concerns with the Grey Knights is if they wind up doing a big range update at some stage for them. There's not really been any big rumours about that anytime recently, though I feel like it's likely to be something that happens at some point in the future. Might just make a few people a little bit less sure about going very heavily into the Grey Knight kits. Sticking with the knightly theme, next up we have the Imperial and Chaos Knights, the big stompy walkers of Warhammer 40k. Again, fairly well known to be one of the cheaper ways to get into the game, and also a fairly fast way to get some models painted up as well. Sure, you do have to paint some big models, but not really very many of them. Knights don't really have a proper discount options, though arguably Games Workshop might see that they're not really needed quite as much. Most of their kits are already at least fairly good value, though if you could find that Chainbreaker Lance deal that they had for the last Christmas Battle Force box set, that was basically a very cheap way to start Imperial Knights, and you could have used it for Chaos Knights as well, using the big one as a despoiler, then the Armigers as Executioners or Huntsmen. Despite the lack of discount kits though, most of the Knights, despite their high prices, are pretty good on terms of points per dollar. The big plastic Knights are around about $170, so just shy of 3, which isn't too bad. The Armigers, depending on the exact variant they're using, tend to be a bit over 3. The on-paper discounts aren't quite as good as things like Adeptus Custodes or perhaps even Grey Knights, but I feel like the Imperial and Chaos Knights, perhaps even more than those 2 armies, are very easy to have a fairly complete army. Say for example, if you have 2 or 3 Questoris or Abhorrent class Knights with all the options magnetised, plus the same for say 4 to 6 War Dogs or Armigers, then you can basically fill the vast majority of the options that the faction can have, and there's a lot less temptation just to go collecting on and buy loads and loads more. I suppose the Forge World Knights do get a lot more expensive if you want to be getting some big fancy ones, though it looks like they're redoing another couple of the Cerastus in a not too distant future. And there are some other pros and cons to the army. It is playing Warhammer 40k in a bit of a different way with a big army of vehicles, though you do have some positives in being able to use them as allies for other Imperial or Chaos armies as well, which could be nice enough if you were collecting something alongside them. Next up, and voted 5 out of 10 for Price by You Guys, this score on the top right is basically a tracker for which armies are considered to be the most expensive by you guys in a recent channel poll. The Space Marines were voted 5 out of 10, a little bit worse value than the Adeptus Custodes at 3 out of 10, though it's going to get quite a lot more expensive later. Space Marines definitely have a few of the themes of the previously mentioned armies, fairly elite as they go, with big chunky guys in power armor. A bit less so perhaps compared with the previous 3 armies, but their main advantage is they get a massive amount of discount options to choose from, partly due to Games Workshop kind of wanting them as a nice easy entry point for new players starting the game in general. At time of recording, there's the 40k starter sets and units being sold off from Leviathan as well. That can get you some pretty cheap Terminators and Infernus Marines. And then for actual combat patrol boxes, the ones for Blood Angels, Dark Angels, Space Wolves and Death Watch are all solid enough depending on which miniatures you want at a discount. I'd say that the Blood Angels and the Dark Angels ones feel like they're quite well-rounded little forces. This one's the Blood Angels one here with the Impulsor, a bunch of Intercessors, Aggressors and Incursors. Maybe not feeling desperately Blood Angels, but quite a nice, just general purpose Start Space Marines collection. There's plenty of other ways that they tend to get discounted though, say the Vanguard Task Force box sets that Games Workshop has just put up for re-release on their website. It is a slightly worse discount than it was before though, and there's often a whole bunch of past army sets going around, say for example all those chapter-themed battle forces that they came out with just after Christmas time. On top of that, a few Space Marine units do tend to be really quite good in terms of points per dollar. Hellblasters are particularly impressive at 4.1, though generally the units that tend to come with 10 Space Marines generally are quite good deals as they go. Otherwise, a lot of other stuff is fairly mid, though a few of the smaller 3 model kits are far worse on that kind of metric, around about 1.7 for a trio of 3 Blade Guard for example. Other things like Eradicators and Eliminators and Inceptors and things tend to be in that sort of bracket. Otherwise, for disadvantages to Space Marine value, their range is kind of enormous and expands very quickly. An army that's maybe cheap to start, but you could basically keep on adding to it essentially forever. They are an army with a crazy overabundance of choice. At the moment as well, anything that's a firstborn kit, so tactical marines and devastators and things, are kind of on shaky ground after Games Workshop shown that they're happy to remove them at short notice. Means that that bit of the range might not be very good value due to having questionable longevity. Rated as just a little bit more expensive than the standard Space Marines are the more divergent Space Marine chapters. I do feel that they would be a little bit more expensive on average compared with just collecting, say, generic Ultramarines or something. As Space Marines, though, they do have a lot of the same advantages and can get access to a whole load of discounted miniatures. I feel like for a lot of people, though, collecting these more divergent chapters is something that you do because you really want their unique units, and the combat patrols at the moment, bar the Black Templar one, just don't really give you the unique units. They give you just some Primaris with some upgrade sprues. Definitely not the worst thing in the world to start a Space Marine collection in general, but you won't say get Sanguinary Guard, Deathwing Terminators, or Deathwatch Veterans there. That's not to say that these guys are particularly bad deals overall. They do get the advantages of Space Marines, generally fairly elite, you don't need all that many of them, and lots of generic discount deals. But potentially for some other disadvantages, if you want some fancy upgrade sets and their sculpted shoulder pads, that might cost a little bit more. I guess you could say the same is true of any chapter though. Perhaps more than most, everyone besides the Black Templars are definitely at risk of their unique firstborn miniatures going to Legends at some point, or being replaced by Primaris updates. Things like Sanguinary Guards, Death Company, and Deathwing Terminators all being prime examples, perhaps. And perhaps out of these unique and divergent chapters, the Deathwatch Veterans are perhaps a particularly expensive one to get together. Deathwatch like their mixed kill teams, which might mean picking up multiple different box sets and putting them together, maybe in a slightly inefficient way compared with some chapters. And of course, if a Games Workshop wind up rebalancing rules or points when new codexes come out, what's good might change quite a lot, and Deathwatch have a whole ton of very specific gear with anything from combi weapons to melee weapons and storm shields and fancier things like frag cannons, and you might just be left with a squad that you'd want to arm very differently again. Can just potentially add a bit more expense there. Next up, and also ranked at this sort of level by you guys, are the various flavours of Chaos Space Marine. I say this along with the Divergent Space Marine chapters. They've got some of the advantages of being elite armies that you don't need a huge ton of models for, but also not really having the same sort of discount options compared with the Space Marines, generally just the one combat patrol box. For the World Eaters at least, I'd say their combat patrol box is really quite a good one, pretty much exactly what you want when you're starting World Eaters. Don't really say the immediate need for any Khorne Berserkers with a big batch of 20 of them. They're one generic Sculpt HQ choice, plus some Jackals to hold down some objectives, and then I guess you can expand from there, adding some exciting damage dealers like Angron or 8-bound potentially. It is really quite a points heavy box as well, being around about 690 points here, and again that's far better than the vast majority of combat patrols, is one of the very best. Otherwise, despite being a fairly recent army, most of their other miniatures do at least fairly well in points per dollar and things. Angron's not too bad at that metric, as well as being a fairly big exciting centerpiece, even if he is a very expensive model individually. 8-bound may be a little bit worse, though Games Workshop certainly ramped up the points cost for them to try and make them feel like you're getting a bit more on the table, I suppose. I have seen some people converting 8-bound from Chaos Possessed, as you get a few more of them in the box, or other various miniatures. The Terminators are maybe again perhaps a little bit of a risky pickup due to the possibility of getting some Red Butchers Terminators or similar when their next codex comes out. Seems pretty likely that they're going to be getting a new release wave. I'd expect the army to expand a little bit during 10th edition sometime. Chaos Marines seem to be around about the same sort of level, again fairly elite, and if you stick to the higher value stuff, can generally be fairly cheap. Cultists and Accursed Cultists and things perhaps might be a little bit more expensive, money per point on the board. I'd say the Combat Patrol Space Marines is kind of middle of the road. Perhaps the units aren't enormously exciting in game at the moment, but they do feel like core and iconic choices for the faction at least. Otherwise, within the wider Chaos range, perhaps for a standout one that feels like it's at least fairly good value are the Warp Forged with the Venom Crawler and the 2 Obliterators. I feel like that one's a fairly nice deal as it goes, fairly good in terms of plastic that you get, quite nice miniature sculpts even if they're monopose, and 3.4 points per dollar. Otherwise, in general, the more elite things tend to do a bit better. Things like Terminators and Possessed are fairly good deals. Things like Spawn and Cultists and things you might consider either converting, kit stretching, or looking into non-Games Workshop providers for those. There's plenty of people that do standard human cultists out there. For the Death Guard, they would have perhaps ranked as one of the very cheapest armies to play 40k with a little while back. They were previously the primary antagonist faction of 8th edition, and that did mean that they had a lot of deals and discounts going at that point, plus a bunch of their units appeared in the Imperial magazine. Despite those going away, I'd still rank them as perhaps slightly cheaper than most, They've still been voted 6 out of 10 here by you guys. Again, their individual miniatures are fairly points intensive, which definitely helps them out, and while their combat patrol is perhaps one of the least loved ones in Warhammer 40k, I still say it's not terrible if you're starting Death Guard. It basically just does slightly overkill on covering the cheap chaff needs for the army, gets you a few Plague Marines and a couple of HQs, but really only adds one element to the army and perhaps not the core things to it. For other standout highs and lows within their model range, I feel like the Plague Marines only having 7 miniatures in the kit is kind of a weakness compared with the other Chaos Space Marines. They cost basically the same price as standard Chaos Marines, Rubrics or Khorne Berserkers, yet you get 7 in the kit rather than 10, the others being sold as a Plague Marine reinforcement set, which is almost the same price as the main box set. Overall not really very helpful for the iconic troops choice of the faction. Otherwise though, they've got a fair amount of pretty valuable Terminators, and most of the other kits are kind of middling points per investment. Obviously if you can find any good discount kits going for some semblance of their original price from 8th edition, then that's all well and good. They might occasionally pop up second hand on eBay and things. Finally, for the pantheon of Chaos Marines, there's the Thousand Sons. Again, pretty similar, and I think I'd actually argue that Thousand Sons might have it a bit better than some of the other Chaos sub-factions, at least for their core kits in the Rubric Marines and the Scarab Occult Terminators. Again, they've got a bit of a weird cultist-themed combat patrol box set, as with the Death Guard. Again, if I were starting Thousand Sons for a standing start, I would probably pick one up just to have Zangor needs covered, and the Infernal Master and Scarab Occult are both fine. Though after that I want a bit more focus on more Terminators and Rubrics and other units. In general though, beyond that, the Rubric Marines, the Scarab Occult Terminators, and the Exalted Sorcerers all are pretty good for Games Workshop in terms of points on the table per money spent. The Exalted Sorcerers on paper particularly so, though I guess you might not always want to run all of them in one game, plus the amount of plastic that you get is of course far less than the squads. Magnus is also not terrible, at kind of average within 40k and does at least get you a whole bunch of points into your army. And as with things like Grey Knights and Custodes, they do at least have a fairly small and focused range as Warhammer 40k goes. The main units to collect up in at least some bulk are mainly just the Scarabs and the Rubrics. They tend to be reliably useful, and the rest tends to be a little bit more peripheral and nice to have. Next up, and leaving the ranks of Space Marines behind, we next have the Necrons. Still I'd rate them as at least a reasonably elite faction, though I guess you can go a little bit more hoardy if you go very heavy on the warriors. Overall, I rate these as a fairly middling faction for Warhammer 40k value. Not the most standouts, but far from the worst in terms of how much you get on the table for your money. Necrons are in a weird place with the combat patrol sets at the moment. They don't have any available, though there has been the teaser of one that should be coming out alongside their codex at some point. I guess that'll be there at some point in Winter and 10th edition. Otherwise though, I feel like they're perhaps an army that's going to get gradually more expensive to collect as the discount sets from 9th edition gradually fizzle away and they become a bit less common or available on the second-hand market. Kits like Necron Warriors were very easy to acquire for some time, but that's gradually going to get more expensive now that the Recruit box set has gone away. Otherwise, I'd say that the old Combat Patrol is useful enough if you can find it, get some Immortals and Death Marks, plus a Scythe. And GW do have this other little Royal Court set that's on their web store. Kind of hard to call that one a discount set though, judging by how much it costs. Overall for the rest of the range, I'd say that they're fairly in line with most normal Games Workshop pricing, points per dollar in the 2 to 3 mark. Perhaps some more standout units on the positive side, things like Catan Shards of the Deceiver and the Nightbringer are very cheap for how many points you get in game, though they perhaps are a little bit dated, and at some point I guess they will be replaced by something similar to the Void Dragon. For the Transcendent Catan, I have seen people do all manner of conversions and fun stuff with that, rather than having to get an entire Tesseract arc. Seeing as they're just kind of bodies worn by the gods at the time, there is a fair scope for creativity and not just buying the official model. On the other end of the spectrum, Flayed Ones are perhaps considered notoriously bad value for these 5 fairly small plastic infantry miniatures, $55 for 5 of these, so $11 each, and they aren't even individually all that threatening in game, and they don't really have any posability or options either. I've seen some people convert them from slightly cheaper warriors. The Leagues of Votann perhaps aren't doing too badly for being an army that's a bit more middle of the pack within Warhammer 40k. Part of the reason for that is that they had very high points costs in 9th edition due to Games Workshop releasing them with all manner of borderline broken rules, and then just jacking up the points cost as their way of making them more in balance with the rest of the other factions in the game. That doesn't seem to have entirely gone away, and I'd rate most of their options as just kind of mid-tier for 40k at the moment, The Combat Patrol set is kind of fine with a few of their plastic kits from their fairly small range. Not standouts, but not outright bad either. Otherwise, most of their units broadly fall in at the around about 2 to 3 points per dollar that you'd expect from Games Workshop. Perhaps not too bad for an entirely new model range. I feel like by that metric their value might drop a bit when Games Workshop probably give the faction a whole bunch of points decreases in their next balance pass in September. If they do go quite drastic with that, it means that you might need a few more Votann units to complete an entire army compared with what you did before. I guess we'll see if they do that, or just add special rules for them. Ranking ever upwards on the price tag, and now we're probably getting to armies that are perhaps slightly more expensive than average in Warhammer 40k. These ones voted around 7 out of 10 out of expensiveness by you guys. First up here we've got Chaos Demons, who have got a slightly older range, though really quite a big one. A bit of an odd army, as they're basically 4 different armies kind of smashed together in one from the different Chaos deities, and perhaps a little bit dependent as to which gods you decide to collect. If you're going for very Chaos Undivided, then you've got lots of options. If you're going Mono Deity, perhaps less so. The Combat Patrol for the faction is perhaps a little bit of an unusual one, in that it's completely Khorne focused. 2 units of Flesh Hounds, 2 units of Bloodletters, a Herald, and 3 Juggernauts. In terms of points and miniatures for your money, it actually adds up fairly well on both metrics, but most of the miniatures in the box are at least fairly old ones, and it perhaps makes it feel just a little bit less exciting than some of the other Combat Patrols. And of course, if you're collecting more Slaanesh, Nurgle or Tzeentch, it's not going to help you quite as much. Otherwise, in the army range, at least throughout the later stages of 9th edition and early 10th, there's been a lot of focus on the greater demons. These are really quite big expensive models at around about $160 each. They do command big points costs in game, but they tend to be either middling value or kind of a bit underwhelming, depending on how expensive they are, say Shalaxi Hellbane being 400 points, but the Lord of Change only being 230. Otherwise, the lesser demons maybe aren't too bad as 40k goes, $40 for the slightly older kits, and you get quite a lot of points on the board for that. Games Workshop definitely have shifted their scope a fair bit compared with previous editions, and they play a lot less hoardy now, only being able to be taken in 10 model units and not vast hordes of 30. The Tzeentch Burning Chariot is sort of interesting that you could kind of harvest it if you want to build a Herald on disc, use some Screamers and Blue Horrors and things elsewhere, though maybe a little bit less helpful in Games Workshop's new era of locked squad sizes. And as ever, there are going to be a few things that are just fairly bad value in terms of how many points you get on the table. The Beasts of Nurgle only have a 1.4 points per dollar, $55 each for one big slimy boy. Again, I think that Chaos Demons might be one to consider third-party suppliers for, either for potentially saving a little bit of money or different alternative sculpts. I've seen some very cool stuff by Creature Caster. There are all sorts of manufacturers that make different demon models though, some similar prices to Games Workshop, some quite a lot cheaper. Next up, for the force of the greater good, we've got the Tau Empire, also in here at 7 out of 10 by your guys' vote. Again, I'd rate them middling to higher priced, at least fairly elite compared with some factions, but not notably low model count. I'd say most of their models tend to be around about mid-value for their range. It is a miniature range that's actually perhaps deceptively old for Warhammer 40k, maybe not quite as bad as some of the older Eldar sculpts, but a lot of their plastic kits do date from a fair bit of time ago. Their Combat Patrol set I'd say is okay, maybe a bit middle of the road. Some Fire Warriors stealth suits and a Ghost Kill. The Ghost Kill I suppose is quite good in 10th edition as they're pretty useful to have in game. It does feel maybe a shame not to have some Crisis suits in there though, as perhaps one of the most iconic units in the whole faction. Their Boarding Patrol was kind of nice with a new Farsight model, but that sold out ridiculously quickly, so I wouldn't have much hope about finding those online anymore. For the rest of the range, I'd say that most things are kind of similar to armies like the Leagues of Votann. A lot of their miniatures are just sort of middling value at 2 to 3 points per dollar. Perhaps some units like the Broadsides and the Fire Warriors are a little bit on the pricier side than most. Perhaps a lot of their value did go down a little bit when gun drones and other things are no longer considered to be individual models, so you no longer really get the points cost of those as separate things within the box. They are arguably tied to the units that can field them, but they just don't really have quite as much value to the army as they did. For making Tau a little bit cheaper, I'd certainly consider magnetising hard points for weapon options. Tau lend themselves to that really quite well. It's quite nice to be able to change out loadouts from one game to a next, and deploy a different arsenal of high-tech weaponry. The Drukhari kind of feel like they have a few parallels with the Tau perhaps. A lot of their plastic kits date back from a similar sort of era, around about 2010 or thereabouts. They've not had a massive amount of recent updates since then, though I'd say that most of their kits do hold up pretty well. For their individual squads, they tend to be at least a little bit cheap and hoardy, with a lot of units needing transports as well, neither of which tend to be particularly good things if you're collecting Warhammer 40k factions in general. But I'd say they're one of the armies that are perhaps held up a little bit by their combat patrol, which I think is a particularly good one. In this one, you get a Ravager, a Raider, 10 Cabalite Warriors and 5 Incubi, and led by an Archon. I feel like getting not one but 2 big skimmers in the box is quite a nice draw, and you could potentially magnetise up the Ravager to count as another Raider if you'd like to have more transport boats. Ravagers do tend to be quite good at the moment in game though, with those Dark Lance shots. In that recent Combat Patrol video that I talked through, the Drukhari Combat Patrol was ranked second best, only just being beaten out by the Adeptus Custodes. Definitely a nice option for the evil Space Elf collectors. Otherwise, the rest of the Drukhari range is in a bit of a funny place. A few of their Finecast models have just been dropped from the range entirely, including Grotesques, Mandrakes, and Beast Pack units. Arguably, all of those are going to be very cheap, as you just can't buy them from Games Workshop whatsoever, so if you want to field them in-game, you're probably best off converting or proxying for them. A lot of people were doing that already anyway, due to the prices of them. They're perhaps on a little bit of shaky ground though. Anything that isn't part of Games Workshop's core range that they sell for miniatures does at least have the chance of going to Legends, unless they actually get their act together and release some plastic kits when the next Drukhari Codex comes out. Otherwise, for the majority of their range, while they might be a little bit lower value than some other units out there, at least a lot of their kits tend to be a little bit cheaper due to having been released a long time ago. Perhaps for more expensive things in the range, things like Racks and Reavers tend to be a bit more expensive per the points compared with some, and so do the Kronos and the Talos Pain engines. The Kronos is only 50 points for a $60 model, so that's one of the ones that breaks the 1 point per dollar metric, so not really particularly efficient purchasing power there. At perhaps a similar sort of level are the Aeldari, also scored at about the same level as you guys at 7 out of 10. Again, like the Drukhari, a bit of a mixed range, except quite a lot of their older Finecast kits are still very much active, serving out their different roles as the Aspect Warriors. The Warp Spiders and Striking Scorpions and Swooping Hawks and things are some of the oldest miniatures in 40k at the moment. I'd say that the Aeldari tend to be at least a little bit more elite than the Drukhari on average, their warriors costing a few more points in game. But they have had a fair few releases of more recent plastic kits, and often they tend to be a little bit more expensive for more human-sized factions. I think their Combat Patrol box is solid enough. Newer Guardians, a Farseer, 2 sets of jet bikes and a Wraith Lord. It is a bit jet bike heavy, which might mean that you're not as tempted to pick up 2 boxes of it, but the jet bikes are kind of iconic to the Eldar. Maybe not the worst thing overall, and it gets you at least a fair amount of points on the board. Otherwise, throughout their range, quite a lot of them tend to rely on elite infantry, and there's maybe a bit less scope for things like magnets or flexibility with the squads. And compared with a few other factions out there, they tend to have a bit less flexibility and greater distinctive variants of their elite infantry. If you wanted some of each aspect, for example, then that'd be quite a lot of squads just there. A few of the bigger and stompier things often have some slightly bigger points per dollar values, things like the Wraith Knight up at 2.9, kind of similar to its Imperial Knight cousin since the points increases. But some of the new plastics can be pretty pricey as well. These 2 Warlocks here are a great big $60 for 2 of them, and perhaps considered to be one of the worst kits in the 40k lineup, just 1 point per dollar there as they're 60 points for the 2. Overall, a bit more of an expensive faction to collect, but still far from being one of the worst of 40k. Finally, for the armies ranked 7 out of 10, we've got the Tyranids. These guys are very much the bogs of the moment, and the main antagonist faction of 10th edition. Broadly going to be good news for them, I think, seeing as they're being featured in the starter box sets. There's been a slew of miniatures available from Leviathan, and it means that they are going to be getting a few more interesting releases when their Codex comes out. For the discount options, the Tyranids don't currently have a Combat Patrol box set. Instead, they have the 40k starter sets. I'd argue that compared with the Space Marines, they actually probably come out with the best deal out of those 2. For the regular Warhammer 40,000 starter set, that one's either £65 or $110. You basically get this entire set of miniatures here on the right, minus the Barbagorns. I feel like that's really not too bad for that kind of price point, particularly when you have some Space Marines alongside it that you could split with a friend, resell, or just keep if you fancy. The Leviathan box was also just about as good a deal as it ever gets for Warhammer 40k miniatures. Around about 1,000 points worth of Tyranids alongside about the same worth of Space Marines, more or less, just for each half of it, never mind the core book and everything. Obviously not on sale anymore, but there's still going to be a whole ton of people reselling parts of them that they might not want. I guess for the discount sets, perhaps the biggest downside is that the Tyranid Termagants don't come with their new fancy special weapons that they're going to be getting in their multi-part kit that comes with the Codex. It might not be the hardest thing in the world to convert a few of them to have slightly different looking guns and save a lot of money. Speaking of which, the rest of the Tyranid range is currently waiting on a fairly big release alongside their codex. Quite a lot of the core choices of the range are being redone, like Hormagaunts, Genestealers, Termagants and more. It'll be interesting to see if they come out with any specific combat patrol set for the faction alongside their codex. The Necrons, who are maybe in a similar sort of place, did get one, but that did come later in the edition. In general though, Tyranids have traditionally been one of the slightly more expensive factions to collect in 40k, depending on how you choose to go about them. You can collect very different looking Tyranid armies. Some of them can be very heavy bog focused with Carnifexes and Tyrannifexes and things, or you can go very hoardy. The armies that tend to have a few more of the bigger bogs generally tend to be a little bit cheaper, though I guess if you bulk out a bunch of swarms with things from the starter sets, it might not be the worst thing in the world. Gargoyles, for example, for a hoardy type troops choice, they're 1.7 points per dollar. Not standout terrible, but if you were wanting a lot, then that's going to get a bit expensive. I'd guess the new Hormagaunts and Termagants are probably going to be similar or worse. Otherwise, for better units for getting more points on the board, the Swarm Lord and Hive Tyrant kit comes in fairly high, somewhere around about 3.5 to 4.2 points per dollar. Not bad, as the Hive Tyrant in particular is quite popular in game at the moment. Other big things like the Turvagon/Tyrannifex kit isn't too bad for this either though. Moving onwards, and now we're getting into the very expensive armies in Warhammer 40k, the ones that are perhaps considered worse value for money by you guys, ranked 8 out of 10 or worse. I would fully agree that these are the ones that are perhaps most considered to be very expensive compared with the rest of the field. First up, we've got the Sisters of Battle, the Adepta Sororitas, and the fancy newly reimagined Nuns with Guns. For a fairly huge chunk of 40k's history, they were basically an entire range of metal models, which admittedly were probably even more expensive than they are now. Though even after they've been resculpted in fancy plastic, they still run a lot more expensive than most factions, mainly just being normal sized humans that aren't particularly elite, even if they are clad in power armor. A lot of their infantry tend to be dispensed in squads of 5, which perhaps doesn't help them too much, and a lot of their tanks and vehicles don't run particularly high in points either, both of which won't particularly help them out if you want to get a 2,000 point army together. Their combat patrol box is a bit mixed really. For a fun little introductory microcosm of the army, I think it does pretty well. You do get really quite a lot of fun units in this. Though a lot of the models are monopose and might not be exactly armed with the exact things that you want them to be, and a few of the squads are kind of small in size. The Arcoflagellants and the Repentia in particular are probably things that you'd want to have in max size squads as opposed to minimum size squads. Despite this though, you do get quite a lot of points in the box, and if you bought these individual squads separately, it would cost you a lot more. I feel like the fixed war gear and the slight irritation with squads is something I could work around. I'd probably pick up 2 of these if I were starting the faction, and then perhaps convert a few squad fillers to make the Arcoflagellants up to 10 and the Repentia up to 9. Otherwise though, beyond the starter box, things tend to get a bit pricey. Even just their standard troops Battle Sister squad are $60 for 10 of them, and they're only 110 points, so less than 2 points per dollar there. The Seraphim and Zephyrim are particularly low value at just over 1.2 points per dollar, really expensive, and the Immolators $80 for an 130 point tank, not particularly stand out either. A lot of their units just tend to be in the 1 to 2 range as opposed to 2 to 3, and on average that's going to add up to a 2,000 point army that could run you in excess of $1,000. Pretty pricey overall. In general, to try and keep the numbers down a little bit, the Paragon Warsuits have a higher one, 3.2 points per dollar there, though they are a little bit overcosted right now. And of course the Combat Patrol. Perhaps another slightly unhelpful factor is that they tend to often run with quite a few cheap support characters that might want to go in units. Again, Games Workshop does tend to charge a bit of a premium for character choices, and as well as not really being all that many points on the board, they don't exactly get you much meaty plastic as well, being normal sized human infantry. Next up, and voted in at 4th by you guys, are the Orks. Perhaps unsurprising to see them up here as really quite a hoardy faction. In general, they've got a bit of a reputation in 40k for just having vast numbers on their sides, which generally translates to needing really quite a lot of cheap hoardy units and vehicles that might not be enormously intensely dangerous on an individual level. They also double down on that a bit by having a fair few fairly snazzy updated plastic kits recently, both some Beef Snaggers and their October Boggers. A lot of those just cost a lot for the amount of points that you get in game. Their discount option is their Combat Patrol box. Again, I rate this one as a pretty reasonable pickup if you're starting Orks. The Deathcopters, Death Dread, and the Horde of Boys are pretty cool, and the boss with a huge chopper and the Mega Armor is fun. Maybe most of these not super duper optimal at the moment, but it does get you a fair amount of points in the box, I'd say the main gripe with the kit is that the boys don't come with fully flexible war gear, so you can't just equip them as an entire squad of choppers or an entire squad of shooters if you'd wish. Otherwise though, Orc units can run very low in points and quite high in price. Perhaps one of the most infamously costed things for how cheap it is in game are the mech guns. They're somehow $60 for a 45 point unit, so 0.75 points per dollar there. Though admittedly if you do pick up one of these you might be able to stretch it into multiple different guns if you combine it with some bits of plastic hard or other tank spares that you might have lying around. While the actual Games Workshop made kits might be a little bit pricey for the greenskins in general, you do always have the option of converting, and indeed it's usually looked at as quite cool by other collectors. Orcs basically loot everything in the lore, so having cobbled together bits of other races' contraptions can be really quite cool, and it can even look very good in game if you put a bit of work into it. Otherwise though, the buggies do tend to run expensive. The Boomdacker Stazwagon is 1.5 points per dollar, Beast Snagger Boys is one of the standard troops choice at 1.8, the cheap and cheerful truck is quite helpful in game at the moment, and that's less than 1 as well, and even the Mega Knobs, who are some slightly more punchy elites, are up at 1.4, though I guess that would go up a bit more if you built one as a big mech. For actually getting some progress towards a 2000 point army, Ghazghkull is one of the better options out of the entire Orc force. He's got a fairly high price tag and is $75, though if you really want to fill out an Orc army for cheap, then the Stomper is probably the single best choice. That's 800 points for just $140, all the way up at 5.7 there, though I think Games Workshop seem to basically never like making it being good in game, so most lists that you include it with, you're probably going to be at a big disadvantage. In general though, Orcs can definitely be a bit of a pricey force to put on the table. Voted in third by you guys are the Genestealer Cults. I feel like there might have been a time when these might have been voted as the single most expensive faction, but I feel like Games Workshop has actually made some headway against this by releasing this combat patrol for them, which I think is such a big asset that it actually makes them cheaper as an army overall. They perhaps have a few similarities theme-wise with the Orcs. They often tend to be not really very elite and really quite horde-focused, and also have a whole load of kits that came out at least in relatively recent history, at least compared with many other factions in the game. On an individual level, their units have often tended to be charged very cheap in points as a result, though 10th edition might be striking a bit of a blow against that, as they have got the entire mechanic that allows you to recycle units, so each of their Horde style units is generally charged at a bit of a premium for this, for the chance they might essentially be able to act and fight twice per game or something. In any case though, this combat patrol really does redeem them quite a lot. It's one of the standout good ones in Warhammer 40k in my opinion. 2 sets of 10 neophytes, 5 aberrants and 5 acolytes, plus a magus and a Goliath truck or rock grinder that you could build as desired. Compared with most other combat patrols, it feels like you've essentially got one extra unit as compared with what you might expect from them. Probably a good decision on Games Workshop's part, as it's quite a nice easy entry point to the faction, and it's absolutely definitely a kit that you could get 2 sets of, potentially even 3 if you really wanted to go all out. You just have to convert the maguses into something different. Otherwise though, when bought individually, a lot of the rest of the range is again in that red zone between 1 and 2 points per dollar. Even with higher points cost this time round, the acolytes still aren't great at 1.7, the Goliath trucks at 1.8, and in particular the fast attack seems to be particularly pricey, things like the Jackals and the Ridge Runners down at 1.3. Probably another good early purchase might be the Brood Coven. Again, that gets you a bit more of a chunk of the army all for one go. Again, might have a bit of an annoying overlap with the Mages though, which you might already have one of from the Combat Patrol. Otherwise, again, and similar to the Sisters, they've got a lot of individual character miniatures, things like the Sanctus, Kellamorph or Reductus Saboteur, fairly cheap in game and fairly expensive in money once more, and of course you don't get much plastic for characters. Again, maybe like the Orcs, there could be some scope for converting some things in desired. Not every cult has to be themed the way that Games Workshop sells the miniatures as a mining cult. You could mutate some cheap second-hand guardsmen or something. Might just have a few issues with proxying different mining weapons though. Getting into perhaps the top 2 most expensive armies in Warhammer 40k though, next up we have the Adeptus Mechanicus, voted by you guys at 9 out of 10 for expensiveness, and again I'm utterly unsurprised to see these here. A lot of the units just feel really quite costly, both for the amount of points and what they do in game, and also for the amount of plastic that you get. Like the Sisters and the Genestealer Cults, they're perhaps one of the more relatively recent armies within Warhammer 40k as a whole, and it gives them perhaps a combination of surprisingly detailed kits, but a fairly points cheap individual units in game. But unlike the Sisters and the Genestealer Cults, I feel like the Combat Patrol set for the Adeptus Mechanicus just doesn't really do the same level of heavy lifting. Maybe feels like those kind of sets minus a unit. I definitely think the box isn't terrible. It gives you at least some discount on some of the things that you'd want on the battle line for the faction. Skitarii troops, Cataphren servitors, and an Orange Dune crawler for some fire support, plus an Engineer. I think perhaps just due to the fact that these Skitarii troops aren't enormous models and the Engineer feels like a bit of a tiny HQ, it does feel a little bit on the light side though. Again though, like the Genestealer Cults and Sisters, you get a lot of units that rank very low on the whole points per dollar scale thing. I must admit I was kind of surprised when the Cerberus dog horses came out, and they were quite as expensive as what they were. $60 just for 3 of these light cavalry at 1.1 points per dollar. The Iron Strider Ballistari, now at 50 points, is less than 1, and things like the Corpuscari and the Fulgurite Electro Priests aren't far behind either. Perhaps units in the core of the army aren't so bad at around about 2 points per dollar for the Skitarii troops and the Cataphren servitors, depending on exact variant. And for getting progress towards a 2,000 point army, units like Core and the Castellan robots might be slightly better things to look at. They're up at more like 3. You could also think about adding in some Allied Knights, which is pretty fluffy for the Mechanicus. They do have strong ties to the Questoris Mechanicus, of course. That could be another way of getting a good chunk of army functional in one go. Finally, last but by no means least, and crowned as the single most expensive faction in Warhammer 40k by you guys, are the Astra Militarum. Again, perhaps one of the single hoardiest factions in Warhammer 40k, as who in Warhammer 40k is lower than a standard human with a lasgun. Life's pretty cheap out there, maybe a Gretchen or two will rank lower than you, but not many others. The Guards, like perhaps the Genestealer Cults and Orks as well, are another army that really likes quantity over quality for the most part, particularly with the infantry units, where in the past some pretty optimal armies might have been running at 200 to 300 models, although Games Workshop has taken steps to try and keep those ultra hordes down at a very niche side of the game. On top of that, a bunch of guard squads might well want transports as well, things like Chimeras or Tauroxes to transport them about, and they also tend to be pretty expensive for the points that you get, as they're tanks but not really with much killing power. On top of that, their combat patrol isn't actually too bad in terms of getting you a fair amount of pretty new shiny plastic on the board. You do get 25 infantry models including the command squad, a light vehicle in the Sentinel, and a couple of big guns. I think the weight of the plastic compares pretty well to a bunch of the other combat patrols out there, but it is also the least points intensive one, at just 375 points in normal games of Warhammer 40k. It means that this combat patrol will get you the least distance towards a fully functional guard army compared with any other. Otherwise, for Cadian shock troops bought separately, that's around about 1.3 points per dollar. The Scout Sentinels, which are very good at the moment, are just north of 1, and the Rough Riders at $60 for 5 are 1.3, again definitely on the low side. In general, if you want to collect guard on a bit more of a budget, you're probably best off with tank-heavy armies. Currently in 40k, Russes are a bit overcosted, which perhaps gives them a bit of an unfair advantage in this sort of metric, but even when they're not, I feel like you're going to get a bit more bang for your buck compared with infantry, which do tend to be the pricey side of the guard. Currently a Lehman Russ Demolisher is up at 3.3 points per dollar, being the most expensive variant bar the Tank Commander. Definitely a tank-heavy force can be a little bit of a cheaper way to go. It was kind of a shame that there wasn't some sort of Lehman Russ tank in the combat patrol, really. I think it's hard to talk about the Guard without giving a special mention to Forge World and people who like the Forge World line of Deathcore of Krieg, or at least the amount of it that survives anyway. Perhaps famed for being one of the most expensive things in all of Warhammer 40k are a Deathcore of Krieg Death Rider Squadron, those fun disturbing clawed horses. It now looks like they've shifted those around and they sell them individually now for $31 each, so 153 bought altogether. So for 70 points a unit, you're getting around about 0.5 points per dollar there. If you wanted 2,000 points just of Death Riders, looks like you'd be spending around about $4,000. Overall, collecting Guard can be a bit of an undertaking, definitely something that can take a while to get going. For potential value saving, it might also be worth looking at third-party manufacturers for just some generic sci-fi space infantry. Quite a lot of them do tend to make their own equivalents of guardsmen of one sort or another, down the different themes of the regiment that Games Workshop fails to produce. It seems at least by the vote you guys would reckon that the Astra Militarum is the single most expensive faction to collect in Warhammer 40k. I think in reality though they're not really all that very different from Admech, and perhaps the Genestealer Cults and Sisters might be ranked a bit more up here if they didn't have some okay combat patrols to give them a leg up. In any case though, let me know your thoughts. Do you collect any of the armies here? And if so, which ones are the ones that you'd rate as the most expensive ones to play in Warhammer 40k, and why? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep videos like this coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.